So, to get going with a little bit of an ad lib here, this presentation deals with how consumers make decisions with using advertising and other forms of input to develop choices about brands. And we're actually talking today, I guess I need to be over here, about smartphones and tablets and the primary brands within that space, as you know, are Apple and Samsung, and there's some other brands besides. Earlier today, I pulled out my iPhone and looked around and realized that I had the oldest iPhone in the room, so I feel a little bit out of date, and here I am standing up here talking about purchase decisions in the category. I need to kind of get with it. So who in this room has an iPhone? I don't care if it's a 5, a 6, a 12, a lot of iPhones, okay? How about a Samsung Galaxy? Any of those? Okay, we got some of those. And other brands of phones? Okay, we got a few others represented as well. So if you think back to when you got your most recent device, smartphone, did advertising play a role? Did you see ads that made you say, oh, that's the brand I want? Probably pretty hard for you to actually be able to say whether advertising played a role or not. We know Communicus, for those of you who haven't heard of us, our primary space is advertising research. So we go in market, figure out who's seen ads and how their attitudes and behavior have changed as a result of seeing the ads. In fact, we interview people at 2 points in time, before a campaign is launched, and then we go back and interview the same people after the campaign has been in market for a while. And if in the second interview, we actually sort out who has seen which ads within the campaign using some proved recognition techniques, and then we can actually track the changes in attitudes and behavior that have occurred as a result of having seen or not seeing different ads within the campaign. So mainly we look at advertising effectiveness. But when we started to get into this market and into some of the other markets in which we serve clients, we realized that more and more these days it's not just about the ads. So there's a lot of peer influence. There's certainly always been a lot of peer influence. Looking out of the corner of your eye and seeing what the cool kid in the room is pulling out of their backpack plays a role. Things like peer reviews online, things like what the salesman tells you in the store. So there's a lot going on besides just advertising. So we set out to do this study to really drill down into some of those other factors and how we could develop a model that helped us understand what are all the factors that are driving consumer brand choice and how do we make sense of those. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And somewhere there's a clicker. We'll just do this. So the kind of classic model is that advertising leads to sales, right? But of course we all know it's much more complicated than that. There's some intervening variables in there. Advertising actually leads to changes in consumer perceptions, and those changes are what lead to sales. So we've got a consumer in the middle there between the advertising and the sale. But we've also got some attitudinal dimensions. So you're going to tell the consumer something, they're going to get that message, it's going to create some kind of motivation, we're using the heart symbol here for brand love, okay? It makes me really want it, and then I'm going to go out and buy it. So that's sort of the classic model, and that's how we normally approach advertising research. Did they see your advertising? Did they get the messages? Did it motivate them to want to do something differently? But we know, and as I said in the intro, there's a lot of other things going on besides just this linear see an ad, get convinced, and go buy the product. So some of the other things that the consumer is experiencing that help to lead to the brand choice. There's pre-existing perceptions. Jeremy Sachs yesterday talked about brand stereotypes. So what you think about the brand going in is going to definitely influence how you come out the other side in terms of what you decide to buy. What you hear about the competitors, what you read about the brand, what you're seeing your friends doing, what they're saying about the brand, and of course what the advertising of the competitor is saying. So it's kind of a constant sum game. The more Samsung makes me want a Samsung, the less I'm going to want an iPhone. So all of these factors are interacting within the consumer brain in ways that we're trying to sort out to figure out how, as marketers, we can be smarter and more tactical in terms of how we approach getting people to want our brand. So I'll tell you a little bit about the device category. This is a category that we set out to do this pilot study within. As you know, and as I said initially, we've got two main brands, the iPhone and the Samsung Galaxy, and a host of others that are sort of fighting for that number 3 spot. We looked at a time frame over the course of last summer and fall in which the iPhone 6 was introduced. So we've got a lot going on in that particular time frame. The iPhone 6 is being introduced. Samsung is making a lot of competitive statements, ridiculing Apple for finally coming out with a screen that's this big. So a lot of activity going on within this time frame. While we looked in our study at both tablets and smartphones, most of the advertising these days is about smartphones. It's where the real growth is. It's where the real competition is. Tablets are just kind of along for the ride right now. So mostly we're focusing here on smartphones. We know that in this category, consumer loyalties are particularly fierce. You're an iPhone user, and therefore when you text, the people that also have iPhones get the message in blue instead of green. There's this whole club thing with the iPhone versus Samsung, and Samsung trying to break into that. So it's an interesting category in which to try to sort it all out. What we're asking here is, what are all the things, what are all the factors that produce brand demand? What role is played by advertising versus these other factors that maybe aren't quite as controllable by you as a marketer? And once we know the answers to that, how can this increased understanding lead us to better, smarter ways to market our products? So granted, there's probably very few of you, if any, in this room that are in the smartphone business, but we hope you'll be able to see how this kind of approach and the kinds of learnings that we get on smartphones can be applicable in categories from consumer packaged goods to automotive to financial services to provide insights that are going to make you better able to develop strategies and tactics to build brand choice for your brand. So a couple of critical components of this analysis, we use longitudinal data, and I'm not just talking about tracking longitudinally over time, I'm talking about actually interviewing the same people at 2 points in time. So we have a longitudinal panel, and we know who felt a particular way in January, and then how that same individual felt when we go back and re-interview them later in the year. We also need to think about all of the hypothesized influences. We need to think, okay, what are all the things that might have impacted on brand perceptions and brand preference during a given time frame. And then we need a measurement technique that's sensitive enough to be able to pull out who has been exposed to what between our pre and our post. So those are kind of the prerequisites that we need in order to do this kind of analysis. So for this particular study, we interviewed about 3,500 people, online surveys, before the launch of the iPhone 5 and some of the Samsung activity and other competitive that was going on during that time frame. In our pre-interview, we just asked them about the brands. Rate the brand, how likely are you to buy it, what do you own now, sort of the standard ad tracking kinds of questions. We then went back to the same people later in the year, a subsample of them, just under 1,000, and we asked them exactly the same questions. So we've got this nice pre-post, and this time we also figured out what they had been exposed to as far as these other influences between pre and post. So if the iPhone ran a television commercial, we'd show a brief clip of that commercial. Do you remember seeing this commercial? If there was a digital ad, we'd show a little edit of the digital. Do you remember seeing this digital ad? And then we asked about all those other influences. You know, did you read anything online? Did you have any friends that bought one that told you something about it? So trying to get at all of these marketplace potential influences, because we didn't know which ones were going to jump out as influential or not. So we wanted to include a broad laundry list to make sure we we had it covered when we went into the post and figured out what actually caused people to change. And so within all this mass of data amongst all of these people and all the influences and how their brand metrics changed over time, we need some really cool tools to be able to sort out what's happening and why. And so our cool tool statistician is going to tell you about what we did.
All right. My name's Trevor Kavarna. I lead the advanced analytics team at Communicus. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the approach we took to try to get at all of these different influences that Jerry was talking about. So in particular, what we were interested in was really the dynamics between advertising, these sort of word-of-mouth influences that you might see, interactions with close friends, interactions with salespeople, that sort of thing. And we thought that structural equation modeling, for those who don't know it, offered a really unique and very powerful approach to go about understanding these effects. And structural equation modeling really, it's a multivariate technique and really combines two elements. One is a focus on latent variable modeling, so looking for underlying factors within your data set that you can pull out of the data that you actually measured to create really stable underlying constructs. So in this example here, we've taken a very simplified case, and what we're talking about there in the boxes at the top, we have things we've actually measured. So we've got brand I trust, it's a reliable brand, it's one of my favorites, things that we might think are related to an underlying construct of brand affinity, right? And we can apply this sort of factor analytic methodology in order to pull out a latent variable, which we're going to call brand affinity, right? The shared correlation across that set of attributes, really we're going to find that as a latent variable, define that as brand affinity. We can do the same thing on the sort of purchase intent side. We can look at past month purchasing, purchase intent, a host of other demand variables you might be interested in, and extract out an underlying latent variable that you might think of as the true demand for a product. So that's the first element of a structural equation model, is going from the specific data that you've measured in your study and extracting out these underlying latent variables that actually are really what we're interested in, right? Because we might be able to measure those attributes, but what we really care about is how does brand affinity affect demand? I can't measure those things because they're relatively abstract concepts. I can measure some stuff that should be highly correlated with them and then pull out the underlying latent trait. Once you've got those latent variables actually in place, you can then lay on a structural component to your model. So you've got a latent component and a structural component. Your structural component, for anyone familiar with your standard regression analysis, it's very similar to a typical regression model. You are predicting outcomes based on other measures in the model. And that really is summed up in a very short explanation, an overview of structural equation modeling. Where it really becomes a powerful technique is it allows for the addition of indirect effects, which are often very challenging to actually quantify within the context of more traditional regression type approaches. And it's where the sort of strength of the multivariate nature of the analysis comes in. So here let's imagine another case where we've got a set of things that we think are related to an underlying measure of brand affinity, a set of measured variables that are related to an underlying latent variable of demand, and additionally we're going to layer on a set of measurements of advertising exposure, and we're going to really pull out what was the actual penetration of the overall campaign defined as the underlying variable underlying exposure to the set of ads within that campaign. Once you do this, you can see that in the structural part of the model, we've now got a handful of what we'll call direct effects. And direct effects are really any place where a arrow is connecting two latent variables together, right? So this is any prediction basically in a standard regression model. So here we can see that advertising is hypothesized to have a effect on demand. Advertising is also predicted to have an effect on brand affinity, and brand affinity is hypothesized to have a direct effect on demand. What's really beautiful about structural equation modeling, though, is the ability to also pull out indirect effects. So we can not only see what's the direct effect of advertising on demand, but also what's the effect of advertising on demand via its effect on affinity, right? So here we've got 3 direct effects. We've also got this indirect effect that we can actually model out in this sort of approach. Really powerful when you want to know sort of, well, maybe I don't think that advertising actually has this direct effect, but surely it's working, right? And the way it's working is through its effect on affinity. Structural equation modeling, a really perfect methodology for pulling out those sorts of effects, if that's the sort of thing that you're after. So let's take this to another level of complexity and think about it within the context of this Apple and Samsung battle that we were talking about in this study. So here we've sort of generalized this to just brand A and brand B. Jerry will give a little bit more context for where this is Samsung and where this is Apple. But what we ultimately end up with is a relatively complex model of the hypothesized relationships between advertising, word of mouth, all of those sort of brand perceptions, brand affinity dimensions, and ultimately choice for the brand. Importantly, we wanted to focus on this not only for the brand that you're actually making that we're interested in the choice for, but also a primary competitor. So here you might think of this as Apple's advertising, Apple's word of mouth about Apple, perceptions about Apple, and choice about Apple, but also Samsung's advertising. So to go a little bit deeper into this, after you run your structural equation model, and this is a sort of highly generalized version of this, you get a model like this, where we can look at which of those arrows are actually having a significant effect on what we ultimately care about, which is brand choice, right? And to talk a little bit more about that, here's Jerry.
Okay, so there's a lot of arrows here. To start to make sense of them, if we look first at what we would expect, how we would expect advertising to work in its simplest form, advertising for brand A creates choice for brand A. So I saw an ad and now I want it. And certainly we see quite a bit of that going on in this category. The effects of the advertising are highly dependent on the creative, so not just any old ad will convince people to buy an iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy. It has to be the right creative approach. So we always couch this by saying it's not just advertising that works, it's particular advertising that works. In this case, we found that the iPhone campaign was better than the Samsung campaign, generally in terms of driving direct demand for the product. And I don't know whether these commercials are going to play or not, but we'll give it a shot. So this is a couple of, and we don't have any sound. So I'm going to tell you about this commercial. So these are a couple of the commercials that were most effective in terms of, for iPhone, this is actually an AT&T commercial. So the assumption is you already know you want an iPhone. You already know why it's cool. I'm going to give you some special reasons to come in and buy one today. It was a very assumptive strategy, and it works for iPhone because people know how cool iPhone is and what kinds of features it has. For Samsung, it was a little bit different of a story. This is a commercial in which they were talking about a particular feature of this phone and the camera and the quality of the video that you can take in a family situation. So it had to do with the actual feature of the phone, and it also was helping people think about how it would fit into their lives. Okay, I've got this kid, I'm going to take their picture. So a very different approach, but amongst all of the advertising that was out there, these are the ones that were working the best for these brands with their very different marketplace conditions. We also, within our overall buckets like advertising, we're able to drill down into which individual elements within a campaign are working. So here we can see things like what was the role played by TV versus digital versus some of the more non-traditional branded media like Facebook posts and things like that. But then there's another really interesting advertising effect that we were able to uncover here, and it certainly exists in a lot of categories, although maybe particularly strong in categories like this, which is that seeing advertising makes people talk about the brand. And when people talk about the brand, it helps build brand perceptions. So I see a commercial, I talk to you about the commercial, or I talk to you about what I learned in the commercial, and it makes you think better of the brand. And therefore you want one. So there's this whole indirect way that advertising is working in this category through the word of mouth channel. And there's ways that as an advertiser, if you know that about your brand or you're trying to create that dynamic, you can certainly enhance that. I've got a couple of commercials here that were actually Super Bowl commercials outside of the smartphone category that are examples of that. The first one, if you remember, in 2014, the Coke commercial in which people were singing America the Beautiful in different languages, got a lot of talk going. More recently, and probably even a more directed example, was the Like a Girl campaign for Always. Got a lot of people talking. So maybe it didn't sell Always directly, but it got a lot of people talking about the brand in a way that really built brand preference and actually led to sales. There have been some published reports about the success of that campaign. So getting people talking can be a very powerful way to impact on sales of a product. We didn't find, interestingly, in this category, much of a direct effect between advertising and brand perception. So we typically think advertising tells people something about the brand, like it's healthy, it's low calorie, it tastes good. We didn't see a lot of those direct advertising communications built here. Certainly in some categories, there's a much more direct link between what you say in your advertising and how people perceive the brand. Another really interesting thing going on in this category is the impact of your advertising on the competitor. And here, if we imagine that brand A is Samsung, and Samsung is running, this is a commercial that was called Wall Huggers. Some of you may remember it, people sitting in airports with their phones plugged in because their battery life wasn't long enough, and all kinds of humorous kind of situations in airports. And then the guy comes with a Samsung, and of course he doesn't have a problem because he's got a long battery life. So it's a Samsung commercial that gets people talking trash about Apple, right? So this is a really effective way to get people to talk badly about the competition. And then if we flip that around and say, okay, you can get people to talk badly about the competition. Competition may be doing that to you as well. So if we look at the bottom part of the model, we can see that if now brand B is Samsung, and they're doing a really good job of trash talking about Apple. This is an ad that came out right after the iPhone had been launched, ridiculing the fact that it took Apple this long to get a big screen. So those kinds of things are going on, getting people to talk badly about Apple, about the iPhone, and therefore to not want an iPhone as much. We know, of course, also that the more people like Samsung, the less likely they are to buy an iPhone. And one of the other characteristics of this model, when we drill down into these buckets, is we can figure out what are the specific aspects. So what are the things that when people believe they're true about Samsung make them less likely to want an iPhone? So all of those effects of competition are easy to understand using this model as well. With Samsung, they've really taken this concept to the bank as far as really attacking the competition and trying to unseat Apple from its throne. So when they first set out to try to topple Apple, it's the next big thing. They have to try to out-cool Apple. So you're not, Apple, the iPhone really isn't cool anymore. This is what's cool. But they also had to build in some communications about the features to give people a reason, not only to say, well, it's cooler, but it has, better screen resolution or bigger screen size or whatever it is. And they did this really effectively. They still, as we can tell in this sample in our room, have a minority market share, but they've certainly been making inroads with this kind of advertising that really gets people talking and really attacks the competition. So if we come full circle here and we think about, as a researcher, if you're working for Apple or you're working for Samsung and you're thinking, what should my advertising strategies be? You basically, as a researcher, are going to say, well, what are the things that I can say in my advertising that are going to create demand for my product? And what are the things, what are the brand perceptions that if I tell people this about my product, it will make them want to buy it? So those are all the classic kinds of questions we get when we're setting about to develop an advertising strategy. But imagine if you also could be thinking about things like, how can I harness word of mouth to really drive preference for my brand? How can I tear down the competition, whether it's directly or indirectly, or more importantly, are they tearing me down? And how should I build counter strategies into my communications that help offset that? So I think the point here that we want to make is that if you expand your field of inquiry beyond just how does my advertising work and how can I make it work better, to what are all the ways that, what are all the influences that cause somebody to prefer my brand, and how can I build a model that will help me understand that in ways that I can then go back to my office and plan for more well-rounded, more tactical communications programs to really surround that consumer with the kinds of communications that are going to drive demand. So it's to empower you to do broader series of inquiries within your research to help empower smarter and more effective marketing. I don't know if we have time for a question or two. Okay, yes.
So with the iPhone ad, it's interesting because that was like an AT&T co-branded ad. So you can actually isolate which particular ad or the impact of AT&T perhaps on preference for iPhone.
Correct, and that's, so the question is, this was actually an AT&T ad, so can we isolate the difference between the iPhone brand ads and the AT&T ads? And yes, in fact, we can. We know that overall, iPhone advertising was very effective within this time frame, and we know which ads contributed. It just happens that that AT&T ad was one of the most persuasive because it gave people a reason to actually go replace their iPhone 5 with an iPhone 6 at this particular moment in time. Yes, in the back?
I'm just wondering about the mechanics of your longitudinal study. Did you go in at fixed points in time, or did you, well, it could be the same thing, fixed points in time linked to what you thought the memory lapse factor would be, or
Yes.
when the campaigns were cycled?
So the question is, how do we pick the timing in terms of going in? And it is point in time. It's not continuous tracking. What we'll typically do is go in and do a pre-phase before the launch of a new creative effort or before the launch of a new campaign. So we go in this case, we went in before, we knew the iPhone was coming out. We knew that Samsung was going to do a lot of stuff. And then we go back in kind of at the end of the campaign cycle to see what's happened given this particular time frame. Typical time frame might be 3 to 6 to 9 months. We can go out a lot further if we need to because our memory cues are sufficient that we can capture those long-term memories, but that's a typical time frame. And I'm being told to stop. We have a booth, if it's conveniently located right out here, if you go left, and then you'll see it to the right. I'll hang around in the room for a couple of minutes, and we'll be happy to also address questions in our booth. Thank you all so much for coming.